really excited for this presentation because this is a new thing that I'm excited to learn all about. So we're joined today by the team of the National Audubon's Migratory Bird Initiative. And this is a relatively new program, so I can't give you that many teasers because I'm here to learn as well. I am going to ask our presenters to introduce themselves so everyone can find their videos, know who's talking. So why don't we start with Jill? Is that all right? If you wouldn't mind unmuting and introducing yourself.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody. It's thanks for the invitation. It's great to be with you today. My name is Jill Deppy. I am with the National Audubon Society. I am the Senior Director of the Migratory Bird Initiative. I have been with Audubon Society for 2 years. Joining Audubon Society, I was previously an associate professor at Eastern Illinois University, teaching conservation biology and wildlife ecology. My research area prior to coming from to the Audubon Society was on the stopover ecology of migratory birds in the Gulf of Mexico, the Yucatan Peninsula, and Cuba. So that's my story. Chad, why don't I pass it to you?
Thanks, Jill. Hi, everyone. I'm Chad Whitko. I'm located currently in Brattleboro, Vermont. I am one of 2 outreach biologists for the Migratory Bird Initiative. Still fairly new, having just hit my 1-year anniversary with MBI back in July. And prior to coming to Audubon, I've done a lot of field work, not surprisingly, on migratory birds throughout the United States. And so it's a real honor to be a part of this initiative, and it's an honor to be presenting to you guys today. Miko?
Yeah, thanks, Chad. My name is Miko Jimenez, and I am the other outreach biologist for the Migratory Bird Initiative. So like Chad, I'm just about a year in, just over a year in to my time here at Audubon. And before joining Audubon, I was coordinating a community science program in Fort Collins, Colorado. And most of my research focus has been on urban birds, and particularly how they can kind of be used, or how urban spaces can create habitat for birds, and migratory birds in particular. So yeah, a lot of my work has played, my previous work has played into the stuff I do here for the Migratory Bird Initiative.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. All right, I'm going to hand it over to you, Chad, and I'll go on mute as well. And yeah, looking forward to it. Thanks, everyone.
Great, thanks. I'll start out. Chad, you will advance the slides for me. Great. Well, as you all know by now, given the introductions, we are very happy to be here today to talk to you about Audubon's new Migratory Bird Initiative and our conservation platform. Next slide. More than 70% of the birds that breed in the United States and Canada are migratory. And more than half the year, they are outside of the United States on their breeding, on their stopover grounds or their wintering grounds in North America and, Latin America and the Caribbean. Next slide. In less than a single lifetime, North America has lost 3 billion birds, and 2.5 million of those birds were migratory. Our own climate report states that 389 bird species are on the brink of extinction, underscoring the urgency of the situation. The Migratory Bird Initiative is intended to reverse these trends by using the power of science, interpretation, network engagement, and partnerships to focus on the most important places that birds rely on throughout their annual cycle: breeding, migration, and winter, and to be able to protect these areas that they need year-round. Next slide. The vision of the Migratory Bird Initiative is to secure the future of North American migratory birds by identifying the places that they need to thrive, taking actions to protect the places that matter most to them, reducing threats, and engaging people in the joy of migration. Next slide. Audubon is a science-based conservation organization. We bridge expertise in science with conservation and policy. For the Migratory Bird Initiative to be successful, we have outlined a 5-step action plan. The first step is to consolidate and analyze existing spatial science for migratory birds across their entire life cycle. The second step is to create a migratory bird conservation platform to distill scientific knowledge and activate it for conservation. Through the platform, we will also promote science and conservation collaboration. Third goal is to apply the science in ways that support the work of Audubon's conservation and policy teams and our state offices so that they can achieve effective and durable conservation. Goal 4, to use the synthesized science to identify the most important places for birds across the entire Western Hemisphere, including Canada, Latin America, and the Caribbean, as well as the threats to those birds and their habitat. This will strategically inform where Audubon's National Audubon Society's international program and its partners, it's going to tell them where they should invest their efforts to maximize our impact on migratory birds. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, is how this work engages all of you. We are going to talk a bit about the conservation platform in a few minutes, but really one of the main advantages of the Migratory Bird Initiative and one of the strengths of it is to excite, engage, and unify the Audubon network. And that includes all of the chapters, the Tucson chapter, and all of the 1.7 million members that Audubon has. And even those individuals who might not be members of Audubon, but are curious about birds, or they're very interested and to advocate for environmental protections. Next slide. Over the last 2 years, we've assembled a stellar team of people with very diverse talents, skills, backgrounds. We have Chad and Mika with us today, who are going to tell you about the work that they do as part of the platform and our conservation applications. But we also have mapping experts, scientists who are quantitatively analyzing data, and our own communications specialists who can take the information that we're learning, the science, and, you know, sort of typical of Audubon, tell these one-of-a-kind stories about migratory birds. Next slide. Of course, we all know that conservation, especially migratory birds that can, I mean, these are really globe-trotting individuals. And something, you know, birds that travel on that scale, you know, partnerships are essential. It doesn't take just one organization. So we have teamed up with several science institutions, organizations. We have teamed up with other conservation organizations like Birds Canada, USGS, which is the US Geological Survey, another science agency. And I think the most important part is to really underscore the role that our Audubon members play. Many of you, I think I can assume that many of you are contributing your observations to eBird, or you're participating in Christmas bird counts or hummingbirds at home. Those kinds of data are the data that underlie the kinds of conservation actions that Audubon takes. And this is not new. Okay, so we are similar to our other science efforts. We are using those community science records that you all contribute to. Next slide. The Migratory Bird Conservation Platform is an integrated online system of science-based products to inform and drive conservation. The cornerstone of the conservation platform is a spatial database. And this spatial database integrates all of the different types of data. And these data are scattered across lots of different databases, journal articles, and we're synthesizing data for 520 species. So it's very comprehensive. And we're consolidating the information into a uniform format into a single place. And by doing so, we're able to create a common language language of migration science that we can use to learn about migratory birds. We will distill the science to create visualizations and exploratory tools and one-of-a-kind storytelling, which Audubon is famous for. This online platform will be publicly accessible. So when it's launched, all of you can access it to learn about your favorite birds or some of the places you're most interested in. And then finally, the platform, and I should say that this part, and this is the part that we have outlined in red, this is what we're referring to as a self-service portal. This is something that any of you will be able to go into Audubon's webpage. You'll be able to access this, and you'll be able to explore different tools that suit your interests. There's also then what we're calling a full service platform or full service component of the conservation platform. This includes our science teams work that enables us to analyze the data and deliver conservation relevant information and tools to support the conservation and policy decisions across the network and our international program, but also that of our conservation partners. And so with that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Miko, who is going to tell you more about our data outreach. Miko?
Yeah, thanks so much for starting us off, Jill. As Jill just said, and as I had introduced myself as, I'm one of the two, along with Chad, outreach biologists for the team. So I'm just gonna talk a little bit about what we do in terms of data outreach and how we aim to kind of get some of these spatial data into the door. Next slide, please. So as Jill had said, we are looking to build this platform which is full of kind of spatial products that are based on spatial summaries. And all of that hinges upon our ability to get data in the door and assemble the migration tracking data for these various migratory species. Next slide, please. And to touch on another point that Jill had mentioned, we are aware that we're not the only project that's looking to compile these spatial data. So this is actually an area where we have seen a lot of complementary goals with Smithsonian's Migratory Connectivity Project. And we are actively kind of working with them to do some of the data outreach. So meaning reaching out to data holders about accessing and having them contribute their spatial data to both of these projects. So these are two distinct projects, but this is one area, the data outreach part of things is one area where we're kind of working together. And so these two different projects, again, kind of hinge upon our ability to assemble the spatial data that's out there. And so I'm just gonna talk a little bit about our process for doing that, and more importantly, what we've learned from doing that and what it can tell us about migratory species. Next slide. So we recognize kind of that there are different types of data that are out there, ranging from occurrence data, so things like eBird on the left, and this is just pretty, simply is the bird there or not? This is presence absence data, and these are things like I said, that we can kind of get from eBird or other sources. In the middle here, we have data that we consider kind of connectivity data, so banding encounters are one example of this, where we have a point A where a bird was banded, and we have a point B where they can be spotted again. So we can kind of get an idea of where a bird is moving throughout the year, or at least where they're wintering and where they're breeding. So we can get kind of two different points. And then on the right, we have pathway data. And these are data that really show us the point A and point B, but also all the spots in between. So, how they're getting from point A to point B. And we can literally look at their pathway that they're taking. And so these are the data that Chad and I are really interested in having, contributed at this point into our spatial database, as this kind of takes an extra step of reaching out to those data holders and making sure that we have permission to use those data. So next slide. And even within pathway data, we have different types of technology that that are available that provide that kind of pathway. So we have things like satellites, which use GPS, which use satellites actually to to gauge where a bird is throughout the year. We have things like geolocators, which look at the day length and solar noon to kind of dictate where, or give us some idea of where birds are, and nanotags. And so all of these different types of technologies, they come with different pros and cons. They have different weights, so they can be used for different types of species. And they also have kind of varying degrees of kind of error or kind of spatial variability associated with them. So next slide, please. So a big part of what Chad and I do is actually look, for these different species, we go out and we look at what kinds of tracking data exist. And of the species that we've identified as migratory, we have searched for 43% of those species for tracking data, and that 43% ranges across 9 different guilds. So as I talk about kind of what we've seen through our searches, it's going to be in reference to those 9 different guilds. Next slide. Oof. Next slide, please. Yeah, so here we have a plot of the mean number of discovered data sets per species for those 9 different guilds. And what kind of jumps out at you really, if you look from left to right, starting with diurnal raptors to sparrows all the way on the right, is that tracking effort here is not evenly distributed. So a group like raptors has been tracked much more heavily than a group like warblers or sparrows. So we know that the research effort here is not exactly even. And then if you move on to the next slide even more, we can kind of break this down by the types of tracking technology that exists. So here on the y-axis, we have the number of data sets discovered, again, for the 9 different guilds, but this time it's broken down by those different types of data. And so you can see here that a group like waterfowl is really heavily dominated by things like GPS or PTT tracking. So those are satellite, versus a group like warblers or thrushes are really dominated by geolocators. So this goes kind of back to what I was saying, where different species, often depending on body size, they're limited in the types of tracking data that you can get for that given species. And so this has implications for what we know about these different species, and what we can kind of put into our products and push out into the world for you guys to see on our platform. And so with that, I'm going to pass things off to Chad Witko, who's going to talk a little bit more about that platform.
Right. Thank you, Miko, so much, and Jill, for leading us to this point. As Miko had mentioned about all these different data types, we are currently analyzing the tracking, connectivity, and occurrence data for over 500 species of birds that are migratory in North America, species such as this long-billed curlew. And we're using this data to build an online platform complete with visualizations and interactive tools that's going to distill the science down into a way that's not only going to inspire people to learn more about the migratory species that we have and love, but also to take action in a meaningful way to ultimately conserve these species. So moving forward, including this image on the right, I'll show you a few images of our forthcoming platform. Some are somewhat conceptual still as we're developing it. Others will be some derived products that will look as they will when the platform is launched. But as you can see, our platform is going to be a place where you can join the journey of these birds, discovering the pathways that these birds are taking in their migrations, learning about the places they need, the threats they face, and most importantly, how you can help protect them and their habitats. So many of you, I'm sure, have favorite migratory birds. I know we're speaking to Tucson Audubon today, and there's just wonderful birds down to that part of the world, many of which are migratory. And for those who are, joining us from other places, undoubtedly you have a favorite species from your neck of the woods as well. Currently you can go onto Audubon's online field guide, such as kind of referenced in this right image. You can learn about the bird, say this northern cardinal. We can click through and learn about the climate vulnerability of this bird based on our survival by degrees report. And pretty soon with the Migratory Bird Initiative's efforts online, you'll be able to dive deeper into the migrations of these species. So looking at a mock-up of the platform on the left for the long-billed curlew, species that was highlighted in the last kind of video, you can see that there's kind of three main areas of the platform that you can dive deeper into. These include our annual cycles, annual cycle maps, such as the one that's here. I'll show you more of this in just a moment. And you can also look into the connections of the birds near you and how they connect you to other places across North America and the Western Hemisphere, and also the threats that these birds face. You know, it's really important for us to highlight this, not to be dire, but to show the work that we're doing and the work that we all need to do moving forward. So one of the things that we want to do is we want to take the hemispheric approach that these birds are taking through their migrations, take that context and make it local for you. You know, many of us experience migratory birds coming through our areas, whether they end up breeding there, wintering there, or maybe are just transients on their, their way to somewhere else. We want you to be able to understand where your birds, per se, the places that they need and see throughout the Western Hemisphere. So one of the things that we want to do is we want to make this hemispheric context local to you. So for example, in Dallas, Texas, the birds that come through this area, as indicated on this map on the right, they're coming from as far off as points in Alaska and continuing on through Central and even South America. So we really want to highlight, the birds that you've come to know and love and help illustrate their migrations so you can learn more. And birds are great not just for connecting places and landscapes, but also for connecting people. And so we think that migratory birds are the perfect avenue for connecting various Audubon chapters and centers and events. And one of the things that we're looking to do with our platform is to highlight this as well, with the hopes that people can start taking action in their local area for their migratory species. Now, I had mentioned earlier about three main components of the platform that included the full annual cycle maps, our Connections Explorer, and our Threats Explorer. So I'm going to touch a little bit on each of these, and we'll start with the Connections Explorer. So the Connections Explorer is an interactive web map that is going to allow users to understand where their birds go and how they connect to other points of the Western Hemisphere through their birds. So using data from the USGS Bird Banding Lab, we can create maps and exploratory options for people to see that birds from the Tucson, Arizona area, for instance, as I mentioned earlier, might connect as far up as Alaska or into places such as Mexico. The maps that you see here are the same map, but represent two different scales. One on the left is for the number of birds that come through the Tucson area in the data from the USGS Bird Banding Lab. And the map on the right is showing the number of species. So for those of you who maybe aren't as familiar about banding connections, just to reiterate, this is a bird that's had a bird band put on it, and that bird was relocated elsewhere through another scientific collection process. And then its location was marked again. So these could be birds that were banded elsewhere and found their way to Tucson or vice versa. Now, we showed the long-billed curlew annual cycle map. So if we add tracking data to this, the type of data that Miko was talking about, you can see that the bird connections from Tucson actually is more wide-ranging. And this is something that we're learning from the technologies that we're using today. So bird banding is great for all the reasons that we still use it, but it is limited in that we have to sometimes capture a bird to know where it is. And while that is true sometimes for migratory species that we put tracking data on, sometimes it does allow us to see where these birds are going without needing to capture them again on the other side of the globe. So here you can see bird connections from Tucson, Arizona, using the banding connections and also pathway data. And some of you may be wondering what this species is. And well, this is our familiar Swainson's hawk. It's a beautiful raptor of the West. It's a long distant migrant. And you can see here our full annual cycle map that we've put together so far that is using various different data types put together. So this species, when the map cycles through again, you can see is wintering in the southeastern portions of South America, such as Argentina, before migrating up into the Western US. Now, looking closer, the orange orbs are individually tracked birds. So these are birds that have tracking devices placed on them to learn where they're moving. When the map cycles through again, you'll see black stippling. This is occurrence data that is modeled from Cornell. So these are observations that all of us contribute towards when we submit to things like eBird. And so the purpose of these full annual cycle maps is to help distill down the science and the complexities of migration and bring it together in a way that kind of elicits joy and wonder, and also shows the complexities in a really streamlined way that's never been done before. And it's also a great way to show how the species that we've come to know and love actually spend a lot of their time outside of the United States, where a lot of conservation work is needing to take place. And one of the final components I'll talk about for the platform for now will be our Threats Explorer. One of the things that we can do with this is, just like the Connections Explorer, you're able to interface with it in a way where you can plug and play almost. And it's going to take a multi-species approach, grouping up multiple species together in natural assemblages or as you choose against various threats that these birds may face throughout North America or the Western Hemisphere. Now, here in this mock-up, we have an example of several species of diurnal raptors, their migratory paths, overlaid together, intersecting with wind power facilities. So you can see how this might be a perfect decision support tool for those who are looking to develop these types of projects throughout the ranges of some of our more critical species. I will say that we are highlighting wind power facilities in this example, but Audubon does take a stance of supporting wind generation and wind facilities that are properly sited and managed. We think it's a great way to combat climate change that threatens so many of our migratory species and us. But we also recommend that it is done in a way that is helpful for migratory birds and doesn't detrimentally impact them and their populations. And this type of threats, we could look at other things as well, not just wind facilities. It could be anything from urbanization or light pollution. So I'm going to turn the presentation back to Miko again, who's going to talk a little bit about our conservation work.
Yeah, thanks, Chad. That was a great overview of the platform and the different ways that different users can kind of plug into our platform. But getting back to what Jill had said at the kind of earlier in the presentation, another aspect of what we want to do is kind of this full service, service where we inform conservation action on the ground, and we think that this really gets back to kind of the core values of kind of adding value to on-the-ground conservation at Audubon, and that's a big thing that we want to do as we have this aggregated migration data across the full annual cycle for these different species. We can kind of produce original science that plugs into existing efforts on the ground across Audubon and our Audubon network. So if you can move to this next slide. Next slide, Chad. So one great example of this, and one of the early kind of recent examples of an effort like this, is one kind of project that NBI has recently completed, which looked to work at two kind of critically important places along the Pacific Flyway, which are California's Central Valley and the Colorado River Delta. And these are two areas where Audubon is, again, already working on the ground, across Audubon, California, and our working lands, and our Western Water Initiative. These are places where Audubon is already kind of driving positive change for migratory birds. And in particular, there's been a lot of work done on water birds, so shorebirds, waders, and waterfowl. But this is an area where we felt like we could kind of add value again to existing efforts. So if you can move to this next slide. While there's been a lot of focus on water birds, these areas in particular are really valuable to migrating land birds. So the riparian areas and oak woodlands in those areas, particularly in the Central Valley, serve as really important migratory habitat for these different land birds. So if you can move to this next slide, we we want to focus on the Western, on these kind of ecosystems with that lens in mind. We saw this as an opportunity to work with Audubon staff in these regions. And we also kind of recognize that securing water in these regions requires a broad-based support and broad kind of policy support. So we, what's it called? We wanted to look at how we could leverage community science data to look at migratory birds in these kind of local habitats and create actionable items through conservation on the ground that work within the kind of that Pacific Flyway and kind of broader efforts, and kind of look at where this local ecosystem falls within the broader habitat that these land birds are using as they migrate. You can move to this next slide. So what have we learned through that? I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritty details about exactly the kinds of analyses that we ran. Our migration ecologist, Bill DeLuca, could probably talk most about that. But through using that eBird data, so the community science data that I had just referred to, we know that tens of millions of migrating birds, migrating land birds in particular, are using this region, and in particular using the Colorado River Delta and the Central Valley. And in particular, we know that 65 million birds are using the Tulare Basin. And so what we kind of learned through our analyses of these migration data, or these eBird data rather, are that the Colorado River Delta and the Central Valley serve as this kind of waistline of the hourglass within the Pacific Flyway. So these ecosystems are used, disproportionately compared to kind of the surrounding areas, and are disproportionately important to these land birds as they migrate through. So if you can move to this next slide. And so, why is this important? One thing that I had just talked about is that securing water in these areas takes kind of broad support and broad policy. But this is also important because it serves as an area where the science can kind of serve as the connective tissue between the Audubon networks, the different state and local chapters. As we've kind of learned of the importance of those ecosystems to various different migratory bird species. Now that we know that that's kind of an area where we can inform conservation on the ground and use the Audubon network to kind of mobilize and make sure that that new knowledge gets used and is worked upon. Since we know that, and we can do that kind of locally, both within those chapters locally. And if you can move to this next slide, Chad. We can also think about that on a broader scale. So migration is a really great way, I think, to connect people, not only locally, but also across hemispheres. So we know that these birds, to get back to the point that Jill mentioned earlier, we know that these birds are moving across the world, across their full annual cycle. So our conservation efforts can't just stop as the birds move across the border. We need to work with international partners and make sure that we're thinking about migration or protecting these species, both hemispherically and kind of holistically, and work with our different partners across Latin America and across the South America and Latin America. So with that, I'll talk about some of our next projects. where we're actually looking to look at the integrated full annual cycle and prioritize how we mobilize conservation efforts on the ground based on what we're seeing from the tracking data. So birds can kind of serve, hopefully I'm getting one message that's saying my audio is not great, so I'm gonna turn off my video. So with this full annual cycle prioritization, we're looking to, again, kind of use the tracking data to identify the most important places for these birds and, I guess, prioritize the birds that we're looking to protect on the ground. If you can move to the next slide, Chad. Typically what you see, when you look at a field guide, you'll see the breeding area, the breeding region of a bird, of a species, migration area where a bird uses to migrate, and the wintering area. And what we're looking to do is use the best available migration data to identify specific places within those different regions to identify the most important places across the full annual cycle for a given species. So we're looking to use tracking data, known connections, and eBird, kind of bird abundance in these different these different data sets to inform that on the ground. Next slide. And so we're looking to do that beginning by focusing on land birds in 4 different geographies. So looking at boreal forests, western public lands, grasslands, and eastern forests. And we're really, again, looking to use the science here to engage the Audubon staff from different geographies. And we're looking to look at 20 different species of land birds in each of these geographies and build a full annual cycle prioritization for these different species. And I think last slide here. And so by doing that, we can kind of rearrange the deck of species and apply to different planning processes. So, depending on what the kind of prioritizations are for conservation, we can kind of group these species as eastern forest species or groups that are threatened by wind turbines, and yeah, kind of rearrange the deck and inform that conservation on the ground and look at these in different combinations of guilds. And so with that, I'll pass things back to Chad, and he'll talk a little bit about how we look to plug in exactly to the Audubon network.
Yeah, thanks, Miko. So far, Jill and Miko have done a good job of touching upon a little bit about the work that we're doing in a broader context outside of the platform, and highlighting a little bit about how we're looking to work within the network, as well as obviously the work that we're doing with partners outside. MBI has this really great opportunity to intersect with so much of what Audubon does, not only from science, of which we are one of 5 groups within a science division, but also across policy, advocacy, and things like that, and reaching out to our various chapters and centers and groups like that that are so critical to the work that we do on the ground on a local level. One of the things that we are looking to do in the next year, COVID willing, is a pilot project of putting on 5 MODIS towers, as you can see here, on 5 of our centers across the network. Now, MODIS is an automated telemetry array. So these are towers that pick up migrating birds, even insects, that use nanotags. Now, Miko briefly touched upon this earlier with the different pathway data types. But nanotags are these incredibly lightweight tags that we can put on many of our smaller species that haven't been tracked all that well as of yet. And so, we're looking to put some of these towers on 5 of our centers as part of a pilot project in this next year as a way to, 1, contribute back towards the science. These towers are revealing so much right now regarding the connections that these birds are making, the places that they use. Jill had mentioned about stopover ecology on the Gulf at the beginning of the talk, and These towers are helping inform researchers how long a bird stays in a particular area, which is really important for learning how valuable that area is to a species or multiple species. So we're looking to contribute towards the science. And we're also looking to put these up because we think it will be a great basis for future work within the centers, as it relates to various, as it relates to various education curriculums in the center around migratory birds. And right now, it's needed more than ever is to pair our research and the research of others with the great education and outreach that Audubon does to help conserve these species moving forward. And through all of this, we've learned that the migratory birds are facing a lot of threats across a large geographic area. I mean, for many species, they are really wide-ranging and going across the entirety of the Western Hemisphere. So some of you may be wondering how you can support our migratory birds and the places that they need. Here are a few Audubon related programs that we can point you towards, although they are not the end-all be-all. There are many others that you can look into. But one of the first ones is it starts right at home. So our birds that are migrating, they need places to fuel up and nourish their journey. So if you have a place where you can plant native plantings, then you should look into our Plants for Birds program. We are also recommending that if you're interested in learning about your local area as it relates to climate change, you can check out our Birds and Climate Visualizer at climate.audubon.org, where you can enter your zip code and see how predicted climate change in your area might impact the birds that you love. I know for me in the Northeast, predicted climate change might actually result in species such as the common loon no longer being around due to available habitats and conditions. If you are somebody who eats animal proteins at your house, we say you can support ranchers who support our birds on Audubon certified bird-friendly lands. There's a lot of working lands out west, and we think this is something everybody should look into if this is a part of your lifestyle. And then finally, as we say at Audubon, finding your flock, going online and getting trainings and learning how you can become a bird advocate to make your voice heard. All the work that we do is magnified through your voices. And so if you would like to learn how you can do that, go to audubon.org/campaigns. And the final slide that I'll present today, if you are interested in helping the Migratory Bird Initiative directly, if you are a birder, please feel free to share your sightings with eBird. This is a program and a platform that we use. It's at the heart of many of our products and some of our analyses. So this goes a long way for us understanding about our migratory species. For anybody who's a researcher or a species expert, we ask you that you can share your expertise with us. We realize that we are not the only people that may have looked into the conservation work needed for a species in a given area. And we don't want to reinvent the wheel, but we want to add value to that, that area. So if you have information about that, let us know. Let us know who we should be talking to. And if you are a really good expert on a particular species, feel free to offer your expertise in reviewing our maps and tools. We want to make sure that this is right. And we are going through a vetting process with all of our products. And then finally, if you are a data holder for tracking birds, this is something, feel free, if this platform speaks to you, to upload and share your data through MoveBank. A lot of the tracking data is what makes our platform so wonderful. And, if you are interested in contributing that, feel free to reach out to one of us after this. And Nico and I can talk to you about the benefits outside of the platform and the conservation work of contributing your data. So we thank you for your time on this Monday afternoon, and we will take questions at this point. And I will leave a slide up for everyone to learn more if you should have more questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Chad. Thanks for leaving up all your contact information. That was going to be one of my questions, is if we could share that with people. So I'm just going to go back and make sure we didn't miss anything in the chat window. But one thing that I was wondering in particular was, so we've been doing this series on migration, and we've seen so many cool maps and products and ways that we can visualize bird movement. And particular to this area, there's frequently like this big gray area in Mexico. And we know that that's one of the data gaps that we're trying to work with partners to fulfill. But I'm wondering if you guys are also looking at gaps in data or gaps in ways that, you know, we are able to measure bird movement, or other kinds of ways that, you know, might need some work right now.
Yeah, that's a great question, Nicole. Thanks. We, as part of this process, because we're looking at 550 species, which is our total number, we know that there are gaps. Not every species has tracking data, and you know, in some areas, even the eBird data are lacking. And so, by looking at all of these species and putting the data into a common format, as people are you know, flipping through the different species and looking at them, some of those areas, geographic areas where we're lacking information, should pop out. Some additional information, at least for our science colleagues, if there are particular species we need to have tracking data for, you know, but by working with our science partners at universities or state agencies, we can guide them to where those most critical gaps are in our knowledge, specifically for conservation, so that we can sort of all drive them to that one, you know, that one taxonomic group or species where we really need the information.
Great, thanks for that. Everyone get out to their bird locations.
Get out in eBird in Latin America and the Caribbean, please.
And I'll just add on to that. I mean, I think Jill answered that in a great way, and we'll be able to point out a lot of data gaps. Another kind of cool thing that we'll be able to do is kind of quantify those things. So when I showed that plot of the tracking data by those 9 different guild types, and some guilds were tracked much more heavily than others. And that's something that like we kind of know and is pretty well known across the migration world, that some species are tracked more than others, but I don't think it's something that is often quantified or talked about in that way. So that's kind of another area where I think that we can really point out some data gaps in a way that's arguable and kind of defensible.
Yeah, very true. Yeah, I hadn't really ever thought about that before. So definitely something we should be aware of. All right, so I want to invite everyone to keep plopping questions in the chat box. Looks like we've actually answered most of the ones that have been in there. And then if you want to ask a question verbally, you can use that participant raise your hand feature. I don't think I'll be able to see everyone's faces if you physically raise your hand, but if you can't find the raise hand function, you can also just plop a little note in the chat box and we can unmute you and you can ask your questions. I know there's a lot of information that we just got, so I'm sure someone has a question. And then
Nicole, could I address a question? A couple people have asked, Jen put in the chat, and one other person had sent a message regarding the impact of fires on migratory birds. It is all, you know, with so many things, this is one more recent event and it's risen to the top of our minds, rightfully. So especially as we're looking at birds who are starting already, some of them, at least in the East, are starting their fall migration already. And what we, you know, this is a super, you know, interesting question that, again, a lot of researchers and conservationists have on our minds is, what is the impact of fires on birds? And now we don't really know much about the direct impacts of birds, like whether or not the smoke is affecting their ability to migrate, or, you know, if there are any migratory birds that are killed. We have little information on that. I mean, right now it's pretty much all anecdotal or, you know, speculative. because there we haven't, it's hard to study the direct impacts of fire because we don't really know when the fires or where they're going to happen. What we do know is that the fires do impact their habitat though. So if a fire comes through and say it's a bird that uses, you know, oak savannas and fires are coming through, or uses chaparral, you know, these are areas, if they burn, then that's habitat that might not be available for some species. But it's not necessarily bad for all species. So there are some resident species, you know, that will use, you know, forests that often, you know, the plants will need fire to come through. I know coastal sage scrub, there are lots of species of plants that need fire to be able to regenerate. And some birds that use grasslands need more open grasslands. So fire can have benefits for some species when the fires are happening more naturally. Usually, you know, not so intense, not so large. And, you know, some birds rely on that. But now what we're seeing nowadays is that the fires are, you know, relative to what they were like a couple hundred years ago, they're much more intense and large. And that's something that's clear from the images we're all seeing. So it's something that we can certainly, we should be concerned about and look forward to learning more. That's one of those important gaps in our knowledge.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, even here locally in Tucson, we just had a really large local fire up on our local mountain, and we've been really impressed about so far. The birds are just coming back and people are already birding up on the mountain again. But we're definitely still learning a lot. And I would just give a sneak peek for people that our next upcoming magazine is actually going to feature fire and kind of its impacts across all kinds of wildlife and ecosystems. So keep an eye out for that. Okay, we've had 2 questions in the chat box from Laura and Bill. When do you expect this public platform will be released?
Anyone provide Dimona?
I can take it, Jill. So as of right now, we're expecting the platform launch to be in June of 2021. And you know, we're working feverishly to try to get all the data in that we can to build the platform and get all the tools put together so it can be ready to go. And we fully expect that, you know, with data of this nature, that, you know, we will be updating this, you know, after the launch and things settle out as best we can as new data becomes available for some of the maps and the tools that we have. It's one of the benefits of how we're putting this together is trying to automate some of that process. So as things come in, we can make them updated on a schedule as best we can.
Yeah, that's a lot of data to go through regularly. Karen asks, how will your platform be different from Cornell Labs? Well, do you guys have an answer for that one right now?
Miko or Chad? Want to answer that? All right, then I'll take a stab at it. Chad, why don't you?
Oh, sure. I was just waiting to see if Miko's mic was coming off.
Okay.
So I think you're referring to the eBird platform. I think, well, there's some key differences, and I'll definitely let Jill add anything that I might miss. So one of the things that's going to be, I think, different about it is, you know, with eBird, you know, you can submit your checklist and you can see things like your sightings and that. And that's not something that we're doing with our platform. We are utilizing a lot of eBird occurrence data in some of the things that we're developing. So you will maybe see similarities in the maps, like I said, with the occurrence data. And maybe Jill, you can touch upon this, but one of the things we're looking to do is we are looking to have kind of these local, you know, I don't want to claim them as forecasts, but like local updates on migratory birds on the platform. I know that's something that's been discussed. And that is a little bit different than how eBird will be doing
Yeah, I'll add on to that. You know, Cornell's done a fantastic job of taking millions. I don't even know how many millions of data points they have in their database, but it's astounding. And they have used those data to create models of you know, where birds are at, you know, at a, you know, where you can find birds at any time of the year. And if you haven't, check out Cornell's webpage. If you go to their eBird data, you can see these animations of how the species pattern shifts across the hemisphere. And what we are doing is trying to build off of what they've already, you know, done. Because there's no need for us to redo what they've done really well. And so our animations are taking their best science, their best maps, and in those animations that Chad showed, those dark stippled gray patterns are the eBird data. And so when you put them all together, you discover some really interesting patterns in terms of how individuals are moving and how much time, for example, an individual bird spends, you know, away from its breeding grounds, or how fast it moves. And what we are doing is Audubon is working with the Cornell Lab of Ornithology to create some new products that are really, you know, bringing the best, you know, best minds together and most creative people. And, you know, we're looking forward to building on their work. And so it's a really exciting time, you know, for migratory birds. We're really in the golden era of migratory bird data. And, you know, it's just fun to see the things that you know, everybody's doing. Cornell has what they call a birdcast. So every night it will predict, or hindcast, it will show you what happened in the past. Bird migration across the continent. And that's something we're not doing, but through the platform, we're hoping that we can integrate some of the really, you know, phenomenal products that Cornell's coming up with. So we can really give people who visit the platform, you know, a much broader perspective. So the platform itself will have components of our partners. It's a great question, thanks.
One thing I do want to highlight too is that, you know, we do have these great partnerships with people, you know, organizations like Cornell, Lab of Ornithology, and the Migratory Connectivity Project. But so much of the tracking data that you see that really, you know, is kind of like the crown jewel of some of these visualizations we're making. These are coming from countless data holders and data researchers across many different agencies, institutions, you know, even just kind of like different realms of research. It could be academics, it could be people in the nonprofit world. And we're so grateful for them, you know, supporting our work and wanting to share their data with us to help with these visualizations. And, you know, we feel that there'll be some really great things that come from this as a result of everybody working together.
Yeah, it really sounds like a hub.
Last thing I want to add on to that, and I apologize, I think I cut out for a second, so just stop me if I'm rehashing anything that's been said. But you know, we're really also interested in kind of telling these stories behind migration of the people that are doing the research and collecting the data. So one thing that Chad and I are also focusing on is kind of collecting those stories and spotlighting the researcher efforts, because there are a lot of really there's a lot of really fantastic work that's been being done to track these species, and a lot of really cool stories that go along with that. So that's kind of another area that we're, you know, hoping to share that narrative and shed some light on, you know, the really cool research projects that are going on across the world.
All right. Let's see, I just want to be sensitive of everyone's time. Chad, if you wouldn't mind stopping sharing your screen, I'm just going to share one last thing for everyone as a reminder. And then if you guys have any continued questions, I would invite you to email us or the team, and we can continue the conversation. So I just wanted to remind everyone where this webinar series came from. We've been really focusing on migration, and especially the Migratory Bird Treaty Act here at Tucson Audubon. And we have our whole Free to Fly virtual flyway initiative. And I just want to remind everyone, we just heard some great examples as to why our voices and our stories matter. and we are still taking submissions to our virtual flyway project. So I will drop the link into the chat box, and feel free to reach out anytime with questions or your own stories. So with that, I want to thank everyone for coming. I'm going to stop sharing our screen here so we can all see each other's faces. And if you have any lingering thoughts, I'll just invite everyone to share them now. And otherwise, everyone have a great day. I'll stick around. I think some of us will stick around if there are any lingering questions, but otherwise, everyone have a safe time and a great day.
Thank you, Jill. Thanks, Chad. Thanks, Miko.
Thank you for the invitation. It was great talking to you. And feel free, anybody who's on here, to reach out to us with questions by email.
Great. I'll be sure to include your emails in the follow-up with everyone this afternoon.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
Yeah.
Safe, everyone. Take care.
Hi, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Good day.
Bye.